Last week on the Ask Dr. Gill podcast, we talked more about vibrational medicine and how our bodies vibrate and how that energy is then transformed into both health and disease. Today, I want to go a little deeper into the psyche and talk about thoughts, emotions, and the shadow shape our body's vibration. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkelman. And today on the podcast, we're going to go deeper into this idea of vibrational medicine and frequencies. And kind of to summarize what I've been talking about is that when we have a physical symptom, there's actually something that happens before that. And it's not just biochemical. Biochemistry is not wrong. I just want to make that statement right here, or at least some of it isn't wrong. But it's also not the causation of the element. So in other words, when we ask the question, why does cancer arise? It's not just that it's biochemical, that the cells are not in the parlance of biochemistry, there's an apoptosis, which is basically when a cell turns itself off and dies. That apoptosis isn't turned on. Why isn't it turned on? And there are biochemical reactions that are related to that. Viruses come in and turn that off. The reality is probably 99% of us have cancer cells in our body at any one point of time, but that doesn't turn into a tumor. And so we need to go a level above, and that's the vibratory aspect and the energetic aspect of it. And above that is something that is more mushy. And Carl Jung talks about this in terms of the psyche and the shadow. And I've talked about this on the show because really thoughts are vibration. I mean, there are different energy frequencies related to thoughts. And if you look at sort of emotional frequencies, because that's how it's expressed, how thoughts are expressed in the body in a sense, there are different vibratory states that happen. For example, if you're in love, that feels really different than if you're angry. And we could say they're higher or lower frequencies. I don't know if that's fair because there's a judgment around the emotion that I don't want to get into it, but there is a more of an opening of the frequency, if you will, certain frequencies, and more of a closed uh, feeling with other frequencies. And each emotion has a rhythmic signature, if you will. So, for example, anxiety, there's like a jittery signature. Anger might feel hot or sharp, and love feels more coherent and all-encompassing. There's an element of expansion there. And sometimes, by the way, there's expansion with other frequencies. For example, anger can feel expansive. And I think that's part of I'll say addictive, but I don't necessarily mean quite like that. But there is that quality of addiction because you get that quality of expansion that makes you feel bigger than you were, as opposed to collapsed, which you might feel with depression or shame. So beliefs can lead to or be shaped in the body as long-term frequencies. So if you have a underlying thought that you are not safe, that can create a survival vibration in the body, and that will resonate in particular areas. And I don't want to get into the concept of chakras, but I do think that there's some basis for that idea in terms of the types of frequencies and where it vibrates, and that leads to disease patterns in particular areas of the body. So, but if you feel, for example, supported, then there's more of a coherence. If you feel loved, there's more of a coherence in your body. And your body responds to this. I mean, that's what's so interesting about this, is that the cells respond to these vibratory states. And it could be the basis for why the mitochondria align in particular ways or are misaligned in particular ways. And the thing that's really interesting is that the shadow distorts this. And what I mean by that is when we split off parts of ourselves, there's a vibratory state that is happening that's unconscious. And so this can be a good thing in sometimes. There could be an expansive quality, but usually there's a contractive quality. And when we start to integrate parts of ourselves that we've split off, this restores flow. This brings us back into, we'll say, vibratory coherence. And so I think this is an important piece to understanding why some people get sick and other people don't. And when I say sick, I mean any kind of illness. I don't necessarily mean a disease that you contract in terms of like something that's contagious. I just mean in general. And so attachment theory comes into play here in a really interesting way because our early experiences shape our vibratory templates, right? Like I said, if you have anxious attachment, you're going to feel unsafe more often and therefore be in a chronic survival mode as opposed because of that. And you'll be looking outside of yourself to find that balance, which is kind of where people go. And then when you do that, that means you're giving your power away in ways that are very unconscious for you. And so learning how to deal with the anxious attachment style is really important, I think, in terms of changing your vibratory state and therefore your health. And likewise, when there's trauma can create fragmentation in your internal frequency. And just as a quick aside, we see this with neurofeedback because when people have had trauma, there are changes in their frequency states in their brainwaves. And particularly if there's physical trauma. I mean, with head injury, we see higher amounts of delta amplitudes because of the physical injury. And what that means is the brain waves slow down. They don't have as much height to them. They're not as expansive. And in some cases, they're too expansive, right? There's too much frequency. Or too much amplitude. And so with trauma, also people become hyper vigilant. And sometimes that causes the brain waves to be stuck. You don't have enough variation in the brain waves. Right. So we see this in the neurofeedback. We also see this in the heart math in terms of heart rate variability. There's less heart rate variability when there's trauma. And so what can happen is you'll get an overaction. You'll get an overactivation at times. So there'll be fast, chaotic frequencies that show up. And this is often what happens when people go from 0 to 60, whatever that means for them. It could be anger and rage. It could be shutting down too and withdrawing and not understanding why they have to do that. Oftentimes, that's because the trauma either happened before they were verbal, in other words, before the age of 3, we'll say, and so the wounding is embodied, but you don't have an intellectual access point to it, or it's generational, and it's in the epigenetics. And that I've seen many, many times in my practice where someone will say, I feel like there's trauma in my life, but I don't remember anything about it. And as we kind of dig into it and look at their parents or grandparents, we see that what they had is in the DNA, if you will, of the people, that are in front of me. And there's been studies on this in terms of, and there's 2 generational studies and looking at it is people who respond to their lives as if they lived through the Great Depression and people who respond to their lives as if they went through a concentration camp, for the survivors of those particular events and their offspring. And it's really interesting. And they actually found that they had different epigenetic markers than other people in family tree that were related that didn't go through those events or didn't go through those events quite as difficultly. Because with the Great Depression, I mean, that was kind of all encompassing in a lot of ways, although, uh, not everyone was poor during that time. So, and in survival mode potentially. And so this is really interesting. I mean, and this kind of comes to the psychological healing, how psychological healing can change frequency. Because as we rewrite our narratives about our lives, this changes the internal states within our systems, right? And I'm actually doing a workshop on this, and I'll tell you more about this at the end of the show. But when we rewrite our health story, and sometimes the health story is true, by the way. You do have a genetic ailment, you know, not just a predisposition, like you have a genetic issue. It it isn't that you're denying that. It's that you're accepting it and moving beyond it and understanding where maybe the story might change because there's different people have had similar experiences but responded to them differently. And there's countless stories about this. There's a story of a woman who lost both of her legs. I can't remember how she lost both her legs, but she ended up changing. I think she lost them in a car accident. They got crushed. But anyway, she ended up running a marathon on those, prosthetic legs. And she just decided that she wasn't going to let this define her. And I have tons of patients like this, by the way, who've changed their way that they look at their condition and decided to do something that wasn't limited by the condition. And that's part of the integration. That's part of the somatic emotional processing. It's integrating the shadow aspects of yourself. It's changing kind of the narrative around it. It's not forced positivity, by the way. It's about generating more embodied states of grace and presence and compassion and gratitude, which brings in a heart and mind synchronization. So I'm going to take a quick break and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in terms of the healing and sort of culminate with the vibratory medicine aspect and kind of so that you have an understanding of how it all fits together. So stay tuned. Hello, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkelman. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send an email to Gill, G-I-L, at askdrgill.com. I'm happy to answer questions and see and if you have topics for the show that you'd like me to cover, let me know. So we're talking about vibratory medicine and psychology. And one of the things I really want to emphasize is that healing is a top-down, bottom-up approach. It's not one or the other. And ultimately, I believe it is a top-down, right? But when the disease process gets to a level where it's in the physical, you have to deal with it on the bottom side of things as well. And if you think of it like there's energy coming from the atmosphere, from space, down to Earth. And as it does that, it congeals and becomes, firmer and firmer. That is basically what is happening. Now, it's interesting to me that that is actually happening, but we don't think about it in those terms because sunlight basically comes down to the Earth that plants form into food that animals eat, and we eat the plants and the animals. And that then is broken down into energy and then rebuilt into our bodies. And it's really kind of amazing when you think about it. Like, why is it that we don't become cats or dogs? Like, we stay human. There's like an energetic form that keeps us as people as opposed to something else. And likewise for cows, like cows are eating grass and they don't turn into goats. They stay being cows. And when they give birth to cows, even though the DNA is almost identical. Like most of the DNA between these animals is very similar. Between all creatures, it's very similar. And it's like, why is that? Like, how is that intelligence? Because it isn't random. There's an intelligence there that's in that. And I would say it's in the energy field, right? And so going back to the quantum mechanics discussion, all things are probability, right? And all of those things we can choose at some point because we're the observer in the quantum mechanics experiment, and we choose what it is that then is created in our systems, on a sense. Now, it's not quite that simple. And when by choice, I'm not talking about a personality level necessarily. And I think that's one of the things that people trip up on is we think that from a personality level, we have control. And I don't believe that. I mean, maybe to a certain degree, but there's something above that. And that's the piece that I think we need to get in touch with in terms of healing. Because oftentimes there are lessons that we have that from our small S self, ego. Jung talks about this. There's the big S self and the small S self. And the small S self doesn't necessarily know what the answer is. The big S self, of course, does. And it's when we plug into that then we begin to understand, oh, this is why this is happening. And there's a grace in that. And it's not a blame. Like there's no blame in this. It's an understanding and an acceptance. And then that's the real healing. The disease may still be there, but you've just changed your relationship to it. And there's a lot of people who find that peace, and it gives them a place to then, I mean, this is, in my mind, this is true healing, not a cure necessarily. And that's the piece that I think is really important to understand. And if you can get to that place, then there's an acceptance to where things are in the moment. And that, by the way, will change your vibratory state. It doesn't necessarily change what's happening in the matter, but if you get to that place, you probably don't care as much. I mean, you do, but you don't. And the flip side to that is you can cure the disease and live in fear that it might come back. And there's lots of people like that. I mean, lots and lots of people. And this is kind of the acceptance and the grace, I would say, in healing and health. And I think that this is where the inner work really is important, and where shadow integration is really important, because this brings a repair to the nervous system. This brings a repair to our regulatory patterns. We can be more in coherence with ourselves. And isn't that what we really want? I mean, ultimately, it's not necessarily about being symptom free. It's about feeling whole within ourselves. And I think that's an important piece to this. So, so I'm going to be doing a workshop on changing your health story in person in Hawaii on March 14th. And you can find more information on my website, askdrgill.com, in terms of the time and the cost and how to sign up. And I will be doing another version of this same workshop afterwards that I'll be putting on my website and that you can purchase and just do on your own. And anyway, I hope to see you there at some point, either online or in person. And let me know if you have questions. And thank you so much for joining me. And I will see you next time.